How did you come to be in the military?
I was an ROTC graduate from the University of Wyoming. Accepted a regular Army commission because I graduated near the top of my class, and one thing led to another, and I ended up in Vietnam.
Yeah. So what year was it that you graduated college and got your commission?
I got my commission in '66, uh, and was in Vietnam in '68, '69. I spent a year in Fort Carson, Colorado, where incidentally I commanded an artillery battery
Wow.
and as a medical service corps officer,
Wow.
which is a
Okay.
little unique. And
So you went into the military with an eye toward a medical career.
well, not necessarily. I graduated from mortuary college, and it kind of fit. The military saw fit then to send me to basic at Fort Sam, and then to how to be a doctor in 30 days. And so I was one of the original physician assistants. Only they called us battalion surgeons assistants back in that time. But uh, if you look at the school books for the physician's assistant that you see at the doctor's office, there's usually a chapter that starts out about all of the Army guys.
Oh, so you guys literally invented the job.
Well, we were the forerunners. We were the experiment.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So when you said you arrived in Vietnam in 68, do you remember what month?
Yes, it was July.
July. Okay. Yeah, man, things
I
were
remember that because it was right at the end of Frontier Days, and I got back in time to see the end of Frontier Days the next year.
got it. And Frontier Days is like your local festival.
Well, it's the world's largest outdoor rodeo.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
come sometime. It's a great place.
Yeah. Well, I've been to rodeos in Ellensburg, Washington, and I can't remember. I guess I didn't go. I almost went to Pendleton, but I think I ended up not going there.
Pendleton's a good rodeo.
Yeah. And then the only other rodeo I think I've ever heard of is the Calgary Stampede.
Yes, Calgary Stampede, Pendleton, Cheyenne are the big three in the rodeo world.
Got it. And the one in Cheyenne is called Frontier Days.
Cheyenne Frontier Days, yes.
Got it. Okay. So you arrive in Vietnam, July of 68. Um, what are your first impressions? What do you remember about just getting there?
Well, we flew over on Flying Tiger Airlines as a charter, and that was pretty nice. It had stewardesses, and they were sympathetic to all of us going over. Uh, some were returnees, some were new guys like me, and they treated us pretty well until they opened the door and the heat came in and the humidity, and then they put us out on the tarmac, put us in a formation, and this is not where I want to be. Is standing in a formation in the middle of where I can hear uh, guns and sea fighters, and
Yeah. And you're what, second lieutenant at this point?
I was a butter bar. Yep,
You were what? Butter bar?
butter bar. Yeah,
Yeah.
second lieutenant.
Yeah. Uh, and at that point, when you're standing there on the tarmac in the July heat and humidity, did you have any idea that you would end up being part of the Mobile Riverine Force, or did that come later?
That came later after they sent us down to. Uh, I knew I was going to the Ninth Infantry, but I didn't know where. And they sent us down to Bearcat for the indoctrination course, and that's when we found out that I was going down to uh, Delta Company,
Mm.
which eventually got me to the ships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what did you make of that? I mean, it was the first time since the Civil War that the Army and Navy sort of teamed up the way they did. Um, based on the training you'd had up to that point, did that make any sense to you?
A certain amount of sense, yes, but it was a unique operation. That was the first time that that had been done, as you point out, and it was kind of a huge experiment that turned out to work very well. The Navy guys were great to work with, and at all echelons, they just did a phenomenal job. And of course, the Navy chow was a whole lot better than the Army's shoreside chow.
I, I've heard that a lot the last 2 weeks.
I'll bet.
Yeah. So I'm curious. You said that the Navy guys were just terrific. A lot of the Ninth Infantry guys I've been talking to, other than if they were on the ship, they might run into some Navy guys, and if they were on a tango boat, they might run into some Navy guys. But for the most part, they don't seem to have formed any real relationships with Navy guys. Was your experience different because you were an officer, or because of the nature of your job?
I think because of the nature of my job, I was the executive officer of a medical clinic, a surgical facility on board the ship.
Mm.
Actually, 4 ships during the period of time that I was over there. They'd send them to Subic to be refitted, give us better surgical facilities, and we had to move to a different ship while we waited the return of the other one.
Mm.
So I got to unload supplies over the side, take them up the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But I interacted then with most of the medical officers on board because they were part of our team, and we worked together on that. A lot of the Navy guys would come to us because uh, they had a need for medical treatment that didn't go into their permanent records and affect their promotion ability.
Whoa, that's interesting. Can you say more about that?
Sure. You know, a lot of the Navy guys would frequent the houses of ill repute on shore, yeah, when they got over there, and then when they came back, if they went and reported that to the Navy, it went into their permanent record, and when they were reviewed for promotion, it affected their promotability, particularly the enlisted guys. And so they would come to our facility, and we treated and only kept the record as long as treatment lasted, and then we destroyed them.
Is that right? I
We
wonder
were
who
we
was
were a
the
safe
first
haven.
Army, who was the first Navy guy to figure that out?
Well, I'm sure it was some high-ranking NCO, at least that sent his guys there.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Wow. Um,
But
all
I
right.
had an opportunity to interact with the ship's crew, particularly the officer crew. I was kind of the liaison between my company and the ship's captain, and I did most of the administrative details for our clinic, as well as I got to practice some surgery, which was really neat.
Yeah. So in those initial weeks or months of being there and doing that job in that place at that time, what were the biggest surprises for you? Good or bad?
Uh, I think probably when I took a helicopter ride on a medevac just to do some liaison with other hospital facilities in the area. And when they dropped me off at the ship, they went over shoreside to drop off another MSC that had been along at his facility. And when they took off from there, for some reason, the aircraft crashed. They think the theory was that he saw the flashing red light on a tower and thought it was another helicopter or another aircraft, and stalled it and dropped it into the Mekong. But the next morning, I was in my quarters, and I had a landline from my radio operator to me in my quarters, a crank job, and he was ringing like mad. And I answered the phone, and they summoned me to the pontoon next to the ship. And when I got up there, or up and down there, uh, discovered that there was a uh, crew member caught between the pontoon itself and one of the ships that was tied up there. And when we got him out of the water, I discovered that that was the pilot that had been flying the aircraft the day before. And so I kind of experienced war firsthand right there. And
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bob. I'm gonna need. I can we can I just I want to clarify. So the crash occurred at night, and the
he,
next and this guy, this pilot, had survived the crash.
he had not.
He had not. How
Nobody
did he?
survived. The divers the next day went down and found the helicopter and the rest of the crew. His body had broken loose from the wreckage and floated down the river, and perchance hooked up on the side of the ship.
Got it and got wedged. Okay. So he was dead before he got wedged.
Yes,
Okay.
probably before he even floated down.
Right. Right. Wow. And why was that a surprise for you?
Well, it brought things really close and firsthand.
I
Uh,
see. It was real.
Very real. The
Yeah.
most real one was a fellow that one of the command and control helicopters brought a wounded soldier in and brought him to our flight deck, and we got him down to the surgical clinic so they could treat him.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the crew members was taking his gear out of the helicopter and grabbed the guy's shotgun around the barrel like that and pulled on it, and the trigger mechanism was caught up in the harness, and it
Mm-hmm.
went off, shot his hand. And I'm standing right there next to him when that happened. And I took his wrist and I led him down the ramp and down into our surgical facility and
Wow.
took care of him there.
And how old are you while all this is going on?
Oh,
22, 21?
older than that, but about, I got to think a little, more than 44, and that was 68. So
Yeah, 24. Yeah. Did you feel did you feel a lot older than most of the guys, most especially the enlisted men
I did. I was kind of the old man
at
most of
20
the time.
at 24?
Yeah. Um, and I did a lot of surgery on our troops and Vietnamese troops that I felt a lot older than many of them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's talk about the work a little bit. Um, yeah, I'm sure there was probably no such thing as a typical day, but what are the kinds of things that you might see in a day?
Well, I had I had about three major jobs, I guess. I was the administrative guy, um, and I was the battalion surgeon assistant, and I got to do some surgery and gown up and do that bit and wield a knife. And I also supervised the dispatch of helicopters, dust offs uh, over the radio from our comm center on the ship to uh, where they were located. Most of them were in Dongtam. And so we could hear what was going on. We couldn't see it, but we could hear it. And that was kind of tough sometimes. But the uh, the other stuff, the surgery was great. I got to did a lot of debridements every day. The debridement is simply the deal where we if somebody's hit with a mortar, for instance, there's a lot of jagged edges, a lot of dead tissue in the wound. Uh, doesn't have to be fatal. I mean, it can be in the arm or the leg, but you have to go in there and cut out the dead tissue and then pack it with sterile gauze and wait a day or two, and then open it back up and see if there's any more dead tissue and clip that out, which is called a debridement. And then uh, uh, eventually you can bandage it up, suture it, and send them to another facility that will take care of the things like cosmetic surgery or follow up with antibiotics and whatever was needed.
Hmm. Yeah, I just recently interviewed a guy who was a trauma surgeon in Vietnam, and he was telling me about the difference between low velocity and high velocity
Yeah.
wounds and what that does to the tissue, and just how much more tissue gets destroyed by a high velocity.
Yeah, the head on those expands, and as it goes through, and then it tears up a lot more tissue.
Yeah, yeah. Um, was there a particular surgery that you performed that you're especially proud of? One that maybe was life saving against the odds, or because maybe it was on somebody who was a friend of yours? Like, is there a particular procedure that you remember that was a
The one
great
that
day?
got me on the front page of Stars and Stripes.
What's that?
The one that got me on the front page of Stars and Stripes.
Oh, no kidding. Well, tell me about that.
I was assisting one of our doctors, and we were doing a chest surgery on a fellow, and um, they identified the doctor by name, but uh, I was the unidentified medic. But I recognized the picture right away.
You remember that procedure?
Yes.
Do you remember anything about it other than that it was in the newspaper?
Well, it was a difficult surgery. We were trying to dislodge a fragment that was lodged down near the heart,
Mm.
and had gone into the peritoneum, the sac that goes around the heart.
Mm.
So it was a little tricky, but I had a really good doctor.
It was successful.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Were there any at the other end of the spectrum, ones that you wish you had another crack at, maybe?
The one poor fellow, I didn't put any lidocaine in before I started operating.
And that's an anesthetic.
Yes, it's a shot that you insert around the wound area,
Mm.
keeps them from feeling you cut away tissue. I'd
Mhm.
forgotten to administer that before I started working on him. I had about 500 that night, and
You had about 500?
yeah, most of our doctors were in doing open heart surgery on one of our American soldiers in the surgical part of the facility, and I was taking everybody that came in the door, and these Vietnamese Rangers had run into a major mortar uh, attack and ambush, and so we were running them through like an assembly line, really.
You had 500 Vietnamese soldiers in one night?
Yeah,
How did you that must have been a long night.
long night, long day, and long next few days because we had to keep checking them afterwards.
Wow. And so, you're completely overwhelmed. You're probably exhausted, and I guess you just forgot the lidocaine on this one guy.
I just hadn't done it, and I looked at him. I could tell he was in pain. I held up the syringe. And I said, "More."
More. Yeah, I imagine he probably mentioned it.
He mentioned it. He was very stoic. He didn't scream out loud, but you could tell from the look on his face.
Oh,
And
man.
a lot of times your head's down, you're not looking up. But I glanced up at him, and you could see him winch when I was
Wow.
flipping things. And I
Yeah.
thought, oops.
That was very clever to offer him some more. Yeah. Yeah. Hit me again. Hit me again, Doc.
Yes.
Um, well, you mentioned that you had a couple of stories that you thought you'd like to share. Um, should we get into those?
Sure. One of them is the night that the Vietnamese were able to attach a uh, cut-off drum, a 55 cut-off oil drum, full of C4 to the side of the ship. And I went down the next morning, and the Navy SEALs were down there and gathered around this container. What you got there, guys? Because this is on the side of the ship. And the tango boats would go around at night and drag a chain. And that chain caught the electric wire, the dead cord, and broke it. Or I'd had wet feet the next morning, or more than wet feet.
I mean, that's a lot of C4, I think, right? I'm not a demolitions expert, but half of a 55-gallon drum full
No,
of
no,
C4.
it was cut off about, about that deep.
Well, it's
And they
still,
fed it to the ship with magnets.
yeah, it seems like enough to put a pretty big hole in the ship.
It would have. It would have done a major job on it.
Yeah. What else?
I went on a lot of med caps.
Okay,
Uh,
you want to explain what that is?
a med cap is a medical civic action program uh,
Mm. So that's
designed.
dealing with that's offering medical services to the civilian population.
Correct. And you know, we would travel around to various locations, and we coordinated with the infantry to provide security for us. Excuse me. And then they would, you know, kids through adults would come up, and we would treat them and hopefully do some good and send them on their way. It was part of the mission to win the hearts and minds of the people. And it was a good program. And there was a captain on in our unit that was in charge of that. He was the S5 Civic Actions Officer, and he he did a good job organizing those and getting us out there with the people he needed.
Hmm. Do you have any specific vivid memories of working with the civilian population?
The little kids rubbing the hair on your arm because they didn't have any, and
Right.
you were never sure if they were just curious or if they wanted to steal your watch.
Right. Or both. They're not mutually exclusive.
True.
Yeah. Um, Now you mentioned a story about Ambush Alley. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, that was the first time I had traveled uh, by Jeep to a distant location in Vietnam. We went from Bearcat to Dong Kham, and it's beautiful country to drive through. And then we arrived at this area where there's trees on both sides. And it really did kind of look like an alley. My driver says, "Well, now we're in Ambush Alley, Lieutenant."
And it's
That
just your
that,
one,
that
it's just your one vehicle. You're not part of a larger.
there was others
There,
in the convoy, but
okay.
it, I felt a little alone out in that, in a
Yeah.
four-seater Jeep, and there was me and a radio operator and a driver. I uh, I had an M16 that I gripped so hard that I had check marks in my hand when I got done.
Mm. Anything
But no,
happen?
nothing happened, fortunately.
Yeah.
A lot of stories about Ambush Alley, but fortunately, I wasn't one of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is there anything else you want to say about your time in Vietnam before we move on?
Well, I was gonna mention that besides the bomb on the side of the ship, uh, they had uh, everybody knows about the punji sticks and that type of thing. But we were driving up the road one time, and everybody was stopped looking at this newspaper that was lying in the middle of the road, and under the newspaper was a hand grenade with the pin removed. And it's pretty crude, but you'd pick that up, it would have been a little hazardous to your health.
Yeah. Yeah, they were awfully clever. Um, so how long were you in Vietnam altogether?
12 months to the minute.
12 months to the minute. Yeah. And yeah, 364 days and a wake up, right?
That's right.
Um, so when did you, so that would put you back at the end of June of 69,
July.
July. Right. Okay.
That was about
So
that was
what do
about
you,
the time that a lot of the protesters were protesting. But I had brought home a Chicom rifle that we'd recovered and registered as a war souvenir and brought it home. I walked through Denver Stapleton with that slung over my shoulder. Try doing that today at DIA.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Different deal. The
yeah.
the the hardest
You'd
thing
have
I
to
had
fly into you'd have to fly into Houston or someplace to get away with that nowadays.
to the the toughest thing, I miss my wife a lot, and
Oh, you were married.
I've been married for 5 years, and
Wow.
and I missed her a lot, and I was going to try and call her because my travels took me through Saigon periodically, and we'd go to Saigon, and the USO had a landline uh, cable uh, that you could stand in line to use the phone.
Hmm.
And about the third time that I tried this, and the magazines in there were ancient. Dennis had probably given them up to send over, but the wait was long and boring. And the third time I tried, I got through. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning at home. My wife's first question was, "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm just trying to call you." She says, "How much is this costing?" Looked up at a sign on the walls, $22 a minute. 69, 68, that was pretty healthy.
That's pretty healthy now. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty healthy on the lieutenant's wages.
Yeah.
And she says, "I love you, goodbye," and hung up on me.
All right.
After that, I utilized the Morse system, the military amateur radio, and that was a great system.
Yeah. Yeah.
They would they would have an amateur radio operator that was part of the army uh, would call long distance on the HF radio and gets somebody in the States. Barry Goldwater had a big station that he put up and handled a lot of those calls. But whoever in the States got that, hopefully somewhere close to your home, would call collect. And then you could talk, and they would flip the switch back and forth. You had to say over. And if you couldn't quite hear them, your wife may have said, "I love you," but they couldn't quite hear that. So some big voice, the radio operator on the other end, "She says she loves you."
Do you know anybody who's still around who did that? Who was one
Yes,
of those operators?
yes,
You do?
I do.
Can you connect me with somebody? I bet that person's got just incredible stories of those phone calls.
Well, they do. It. I got involved with amateur radio after I got back from Vietnam,
Okay.
and I know quite a few guys that were former and they still are Mars operators.
Yeah,
Um,
man.
each, each branch of the service has some, and when they're out in the field, they're um, done by enlisted or usually enlisted uh, amateur radio operators um, that are on active duty, and they set up these Mars stations at various locations. Dongtam had a big one. I was coming home from there one night, and we were getting mortared, and I jumped into the nearby irrigation ditch, which was a major mistake, but yucky down there.
No, I bet. I'll bet. Yeah, I think that would be a fascinating episode to interview a couple of those Mars operators. That would be
Well, I'll see
fantastic.
if I can find one or two that locally that'll give you a call back.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it doesn't have to be local. I'll talk to them anywhere. Yeah,
Well, I know that, but I mean, I know most of them locally.
I see. I see.
I'm on a couple of nets that I can put that word out too. That
Okay.
if you'd like
So
to.
how long do you stay in the military altogether?
28 years.
Oh my. Wow. So yeah.
Most of that was guard and reserve
Mhm.
after I got off active duty. But I
Yeah.
spent 3 years on active duty and uh, 2 or 3 or 4 in the Army Reserve, and then I transferred over to the Air National Guard in Wyoming, doing about the same thing and transporting patients by air.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, you ended up a lieutenant colonel, right? Is that
I
correct?
did.
Yeah. Wow. And so how long was it? Uh, I mean, when you came back, you were still in the military, so you were still connected, to that whole community. But how long was it before the Mobile Riverine Force started holding reunions, and were you among the early participants, or did you come to that later?
Well, I came to that later. In fact, I was trying to look up the guy that had been the captain that was doing the MedCap missions. Um, was active in that for a while, and I was trying to run him down and found out more about it. But the first time I went to a reunion was many years later. That was when a lot of us began talking about Vietnam and the things that had gone on there, but didn't uh, didn't come about for quite a while for many of us.
Yeah, yeah, I understand that. I mean, there's probably a combination of not wanting to talk about it because you don't want to think about it, and also maybe a lot of people, a lot of members of the American public just not wanting to hear it.
That's right.
But eventually, you guys did start talking about it. I wonder if you have any insights, because you didn't have to. You could have just stayed quiet, but you didn't.
Well,
What do you think it is that compelled guys to start talking about it?
the comradeship, the MRFA has a big component of Army and Navy veterans from that area, and they meet every 2 years and break out into their unit rooms. And when you wandered around to a unit room, uh, most of the stories started out back in the day, and people would talk about it, but they were talking to peers. They were
Mm,
talking to guys that were there with them
mm.
for around the same time, and it was more like talking about the hunting trip you went on last year rather than talking about the war itself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, is there anything else that you think our listeners? I mean, when you think about this as sort of an oral history, what else do you think our listeners should know or understand about the job you were doing in that place at that time, or just about the Mobile Riverine Force in general?
That's tough to put into words. uh, I was really proud of working with the people that I did. Uh, we worked really. There was one guy that we had in our unit. He was the bravest man I've known. He had been a prisoner of war in Korea, and he was still on active duty. And he was the first sergeant of one of the companies I was in Vietnam, and he's scared to death that he was going to be taken captive again, but he was there anyway. pretty brave fellow.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever been to the wall, Bob?
Yes, many times.
When you go to the wall, is there anybody in particular you look for?
I always look for the the guys from Wyoming. There was one guy that I was from Kansas, and I was the officer that took a color guard to his funeral, and I always look him up. In fact, I got a tracing for his family and sent it back to him. But I always look at the time frame I was there, and always pleased to note there aren't any new additions.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, unless there's anything else, Bob, I think you've given me a lot. We've got a few more minutes if there's anything you want to add. I'm not trying to rush you.
Uh, you're not rushing me at um, halfway funny, halfway serious story. My wife and I got to where we were sending tapes back and forth. It was easier than Mars and better than waiting for a phone call.
Mm-hmm.
But we could hear each other's voices. I made the mistake of leaving the tape on while we were being mortared one time.
So she received that?
She received it eventually, and I didn't think about it. I just continued on with what I'd been doing.
Uh-huh.
When I got back out of the bunker, I didn't think a whole lot about it. I sent that thing home.
Oh boy.
She was not a happy camper.
She wasn't. Did she let you know that
Oh
by
yeah,
sending a tape telling
yeah.
you? What did she
She
say?
were she followed me in the news. She knew more about what was going on probably than I did.
Wow.
She'd watch the evening news, and then when I made that phone call to her, she knew that we'd been mortared in Dongtam, but I had been out on the road somewhere else. I think I was up in Saigon then. But that was her first thought, was that I'd been hurt. And she
You
still worries about me, and we'll be married 60 years in June.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. So I'm sorry, when you sent her the tape that included the sounds of, mortars falling around you, did she did she send you back a tape letting you know what she thought of that?
Oh yes.
What did it say?
I'm not sure, but
But wasn't good.
well, it was a little blistering.
That's good.
It
What's your
was,
wife's
it was, she was tuning me out where she was feeling for me both. I mean, it was worried about me. So there was a little bit of each.
Yeah. What's her name?
Betty.
Betty.
Yeah, I had her name on the front of my Jeep for a long time. Betty Ann.
Oh man. And you said you had been married for 5 years, so you must have gotten married at what, 19?
I was 20 and she was 19.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was before the age of majority was 21 then.
Sure, sure.
So we had to get our parents' permission to get married. And I tease her that we didn't legally get married because where we signed the wedding papers was in the bar at the local country club. And there's a sign that says no minors allowed. And that's where we signed the wedding license.
Wow. And how did you two meet?
High school sweethearts.
High school sweethearts. Wow. And you said 60 years next year
In June.
in June. Wow. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Seems like you're living well, bouncing back
We,
and forth between Casa Grande and Cheyenne. That seems like a pretty good axis.
except for the drive, it's a great deal. Uh,
Yeah.
but you know, it's been a good life, and we've enjoyed it, and we try and do the best we can and keep moving on.